Okay, everyone. I'd like to welcome all of you to our webinar today. Thank you very much for everyone who's in attendance. This is also being recorded in the event that you would like to hear the recording again. And so without further ado, I'd like to just introduce you to the panelists today. We first have Cathy Buerger, who is the Director of Research at the Dangerous Speech Project. And she is a research affiliate of the University of Connecticut's Economic and Social Rights Research Group and the managing editor of the Journal of Human Rights and an editor of the Teaching Human Rights database. She also holds a PhD in anthropology from the University of Connecticut. Tim Phillips is the founder and CEO of Beyond Conflict. And using the unique approach of shared experience, Tim has helped to catalyze the peace and reconciliation processes in several countries, which includes Northern Ireland, El Salvador, and South Africa. He has advised the United Nations, the US State Department, and the Council of Europe, and he's been a frequent speaker in various international and national forums. And he's also helped to launch and serve on the advisory committee of the Club of Madrid, which is a forum of over 90 former democratic heads of state and government. Olufemi Sodipo is the founder of PIN. He's also a Peace Initiatives Network in Nigeria, and also the main partner of Beyond Conflict in Nigeria. Michael is a prominent peace builder who's come often back and forth with the State Department and has advised and served on various conversations about peace building and CVE in Nigeria. Both in Nigeria and outside the country. And my name is Karen Bernstein, and I'm the International Peacebuilding Program Manager at Beyond Conflict. For most of my career, I've worked in entrenched violent conflict and post-conflict reconstruction settings like Israel, Palestine, Cambodia, Nepal, the US, Northern Ireland, and South Sudan. And I've been with Beyond Conflict for the last 2.5 years while I've been managing the project in Nigeria. It's a pleasure to be with all of you today. And so without further ado, I would like to introduce Cathy Buerger, who will be our first speaker.
Hi, thank you so much for having me today. I'm going to share my screen. Can you see that?
Yes, we can, Cathy.
Okay, great. Great, so yes, my name is Cathy Buerger. I am the Director of Research at the Dangerous Speech Project, and we're a small NGO based in Washington, D.C., and we study the relationship between speech and intergroup violence. And we also look at productive methods of responding to that speech in ways that might disrupt that relationship. So I'm going to start the webinar today by introducing some kind of theoretical points about what dangerous speech is, how we at the Dangerous Speech Project identify and analyze that speech, and some of the research that we've done into looking at responses to it. I'll start by just presenting our working definition. I know that dangerous speech is a term that might not be as familiar to some as other terms like hate speech, but we do see these terms as distinct. So we define dangerous speech as any form of expression that can increase the risk that people will condone or commit violence against members of another group. And the condone piece of this definition is really important. We know that even in the largest scale incidents of mass violence, it's usually only a very small percentage of the population that's actually committing the violence. But there's a much larger part of the population that is allowing it to happen, either by actively supporting those committing the violence or by passively condoning it, by not standing up and saying this needs to stop. So we're very interested in looking at the public speech that circulates in the weeks and months and years before mass violence that prepares audiences to allow that violence to take place. Our executive director, Susan Benich, coined the term dangerous speech after doing some research into this public speech that preceded incidents of mass violence across history. And she noticed that there were really striking similarities in the rhetorical patterns that were used. These similarities existed across languages, across cultures, across time periods, in different countries and different parts of the world, right? We see the same kinds of rhetorical tropes coming up again and again. And one of them that you'll be hearing about a lot today, probably familiar with already is dehumanization. So we call these the hallmarks of dangerous speech. Dehumanization, like I said, is one that I'm sure you've heard of and you'll hear much more about today. But this is not the only hallmark that we study at the Dangerous Speech Project. We also study others, such as accusation in a mirror, which is a very interesting hallmark. This term actually comes out of a propaganda manual that was discovered after the genocide in Rwanda. And it refers to speech that accuses members of another group of planning to do something to the in-group, when in fact it is the in-group that is planning to do that exact thing to that other group. And the way this works, where dehumanization might make violence seem acceptable, accusation in a mirror makes it seem necessary because it puts people into the frame of mind of self-defense, right? We have to do something about that other group before they do it to us. Two other hallmarks that are very common. One of them is the assertion of attack on women and girls of the in-group. So this is saying that members of another group pose an immediate threat, either that they have committed acts of violence or aggression against women and girls of the in-group, or that they kind of pose a generalized threat to the women and girls of the in-group. And then threat to purity, this notion that the mere presence of members of another group is contaminating in some way, right? That they are a threat because they threaten the integrity, the purity of the in-group. This is closely linked with invasion rhetoric, the idea that another group might be invading our space, our territory. One that I don't have listed up here that more targets members of the in-group is speech that claims that those who are sympathetic to the target group might be being disloyal, right? That they are not good patriots or they are not loyal members of the group. All of these are different kinds of messages that we associate with dangerous speech. And to me, the interesting thing here that helps when we're thinking about, are we hearing dangerous speech, is that all of these hallmarks are related to fear more than they are related to hatred. This is speech that is making people feel that another group poses a threat to their existence, their health, their well-being, something like that. So this is really more fear speech than it is hate speech. Now, even though we've done a lot of research into the kinds of hallmarks of dangerous speech, we can't look at them in isolation. I often tell groups when I'm speaking to them that, I could come on to the talk and share lots of hallmarks of dangerous speech against members of another group, and you would be shocked and horrified, as you should be, but you probably would not be moved toward violence, and there are lots of reasons for that. So whenever we are doing an analysis of dangerous speech, we can't look just at the words, right? We have to look at this larger context. So we use a 5-part framework when we're analyzing whether the speech has the ability to move people toward violence. We look at the speaker. Does the speaker have a particular kind of authority with that audience? Are they coming from a high social status? Are they a celebrity? Are they known for being charismatic? Might they have some kind of control over force that might make it less likely for people to speak out against that person? If so, any of those qualities might make the speech more likely to be to have an impact on an audience, right? When we're looking at the audience, we're interested in what kinds of things has that audience experienced in the past, or what are they experiencing now that might make them hear a message in a different way. So if they have experienced violence in the recent past, then speech that is suggesting that there might be a threat of violence might feel more real or more possible than it might for an audience that has never experienced violence. Similarly, we're interested in how that audience relates to the target group. Are these two groups in competition for resources, for example? That might change the way messages land. The context is a very large section of information, obviously. It's kind of everything else, right? Anything else that can potentially impact the way that a message is received. This can be things like the legal structure in the country. If, for example, the two groups in question, the in-group and the out-group, if they do not hold the same legal rights, if the state has already decided that one of those groups is not worthy of legal protection, then perhaps that message that says that other group is different might come across more strongly. We also look at things like very large scale impacts, for example, global warming that might be causing migration changes in a country that might be putting additional stress on a society. Everything like that would fall into the context. And we're also interested in the medium. The medium just means the way that the message reaches the audience. So that can be a very specific thing, like was it on Facebook? Was it in a public space? But we're also interested in how that particular medium fits into the larger media ecosystem. So a message that comes across on a mainstream news site with a large audience has a higher chance of being believable, right? Of being seen as authoritative than if it was a message on a fringe blog that is only read by 25 people every month. So we're trying to figure out what that medium is and how it fits into the larger picture. Now, obviously, we won't always have all of this information when we're doing an analysis. So we try to find as much as we can to make an informed kind of guess about whether the speech has the ability to move populations toward violence. Now, when we think about this 5-part framework, we also can think about how it's very hard to imagine that translating very easily into something like a social media company's policies when they're dealing with speech, right? It's a lot of information to ask when we're doing an analysis. And so one of the things that we're very interested in studying at the Dangerous Speech Project are responses to speech that are led by people who live in a context, who understand all of this information quickly and intuitively, and are choosing to respond in ways to try and diminish the harmful impact of speech. One of these methods is counterspeech. So we define counterspeech as any direct response to hateful or harmful speech which seeks to undermine it. And I'm an anthropologist by training, and I've been lucky enough since I joined the DSP to conduct over 50 interviews with counterspeakers from around the world. And they come from a variety of different projects with different goals and different methods. And I obviously don't have time to tell you about all of them today, but I'm going to tell you just about 2 for the sake of time to highlight some of the different methods and goals that we have seen. So the first one is I Am Here. So this is Mina Dennart. Mina Dennart is an Iranian-born Swedish journalist and activist. And around 2015, 2016, she started noticing a really big uptick in xenophobic speech on social media in Sweden. Now, Mina had experienced xenophobia her whole life, but she said that this felt different because she felt like, quote unquote, good people were posting this really hateful rhetoric online. And she wanted to do something about it. She tried responding, but she felt that either her messages would get lost in these large comment threads, or the people posting hatred would turn their hatred against her. So she was trying to figure out what to do, and she came up with a plan. She decided to invite 20 of her friends to a closed Facebook group where they would organize their counter speech. They would find comment threads that had hatred in them, often below newspaper articles, things like that, that were posted on public pages. And they would post links to those comment threads in their closed Facebook group. And then they would all go on together and write counter speech, responding, challenging the disinformation, posting positive fact-based comments. And here's the trick. They would also like each other's comments. Now on public pages, Facebook often ranks comments not in the order in which they come in, but in the order of engagement. So the comments that have the more likes or replies get moved to the top. So their plan was to have these positive fact-based comments at the very top of the comment threads and bury the hatred at the bottom. Now this method works because they're not actually trying to change the minds of those posting hatred. They're trying to reach this larger reading audience that is going to encounter the speech online in the same way that hatred can have a very large impact online because lots of people can see it and link to it. Counter speech can also reach a much larger audience. And so that is their goal. And what started as 20 people is now over 70,000 in the Swedish group. And the group has been replicated in over 14 countries. There are over 150 people involved in this counter speech effort around the world. Now, a very different method of response can be seen from the Twitter handle, Yes, You're Racist. This is an American Twitter handle and was started by a man named Logan Smith. He started it after Barack Obama was elected president, and he was just getting really sick of hearing people say, well, now we're a post-racial nation. He was saying, we're not at all. There's so much racism all the time. And so he went on to Twitter and he searched for the phrase, "I'm not a racist, but," which is inevitably, of course, followed by something very racist. And he was just really disheartened to see how many times that phrase was used. And so he started this Twitter handle, "Yes, you're racist," and just started retweeting everything that he saw that started with, "I'm not a racist, but." Now, in the beginning, his effort was also not designed with the goal of changing the minds of those people who were posting that content. He's the first one to admit that shaming someone publicly is not a great way to get someone to change their beliefs, right? His effort was to broadcast this hatred, which seems a bit counterintuitive, but as a public education effort to make people aware that it existed and that it was a problem we should focus on. Now, his effort changed a bit, and if you know his account, you probably know it from this. After the marches in Charlottesville, he posted, "If you recognize any of the Nazis marching in Charlottesville, send me their names and profiles and I'll make them famous. Good night, alt-right." Many of the people in these photos were identified through this post. There were hundreds of comments trying to figure out who these people were and to out them on social media. Notably, one person lost their job from this Twitter post, and one person was misidentified in this, and his family received death threats despite the fact that he was not at the event. So I like to use this example, one, to show that often when we think about responding to hatred online, there are lots of kind of funny and heartwarming stories of it working, but there are also risks that can come along with it. So these are just two of the examples that we've documented, and we've really learned that there's a lot of research suggesting that counter might not be super effective at changing someone's mind or behavior. You know, we're really good as humans at ignoring information that runs counter to what we already believe, but that we've learned that counter speech works in lots of different ways and is often being used by counter speakers to target others instead of the people who are posting hatred. So I'm going to stop here because I'm pretty sure I'm at time, and I will pass it off to the next panelist. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cathy. That was really interesting, a good overview with lots of practical examples. So I'd like Olufemi Sodipo, who is the next speaker, to attempt to, Michael, are you able, Michael is calling us from Nigeria today, so it's, the connection is not always great. Michael, are you able to hear and speak? Michael? Michael, are you able to hear us? Okay. So I think until Michael sorts out his connection issues, Tim, would you care to be the next presenter?
Sure. And oh, I think Michael's back.
Hey, Michael, can you hear us now? Michael? Yes, we can hear you now. Go ahead, please.
Yes, I'm back. Yes, I'm. Yes.
Yes. Go ahead, please.
Yes. So
Michael has to turn off one of the devices.
let me leave this. Yeah. So as part of my work, as part of my peace building work, I coordinate a large network of peace builders in Nigeria, in the north and also in the south. And what we do mainly is to see how we could also work how to counter hate speech. Now, we create programs that focus on inter-religious understanding and interventions that will counter dehumanizations and hate speech. Can you see any?
Perfectly.
Good. So in June 2019, Beyond Conflict and Peace Initiative Network conducted a 2-day workshop on the psychology of dehumanization and inter-religious violence, and whereby we invited 25 local peace builders and media experts across the country, across Nigeria. And what we look at, the goal was to obtain information that could help us design a larger research project that include radio programming, television, social media, that could change the attitude of Nigerians, both Christian and Muslim, vice versa. because we find that hate speech cut across every region, both north, south, Christian, Muslim, ethnicity. So it has no boundary. And so it's online, both offline and on radio. So mainly, religion is a very, because Nigeria is a very, the issue we have in Nigeria is issue of identity. Religion is such a strong identity factor for so many in Nigeria. It's a very powerful one that, if not well managed, it could snowball into big violence. So, and Nigeria is home to both the largest number of Christians and Christians. And exact figure, it's not. It's just estimate of about 46% Christian, 52% Muslim, cut across both North and South. And according to Pew Research Center in Washington, D.C. on religion in sub-Saharan Africa, that was what they come about, that it's not whether it's not that analysis is not correct, because we have both religion across, like in the middle belt of the country, you find both Christian and Muslims, and hate speech could, it could just switch. There's a thin line between ethnicity and religion in Nigeria. It could be religious, and before you know it, it could just snowball into ethnicity. And you find even offline, like people calling Nigeria zoo, other people saying that the Christian narrative that pitch conflict motivated by religion is a very, very significant one in Nigeria. And this also includes intra-religious violence, even among the same Christian, maybe Christian or Muslim. You find that, like when you talk of the Muslim, we have the Sunni and we have the Shia. These are all intra-religious violence going on, and it also go with the hate speech. So, like in the area that have much more religious conflict include Northwest. In Northwest, in Kaduna, is a very huge factor that have both North and South, and it's also divided along ethnic and religious line. In the North, you find the Muslims, and then in the South, you find the Christians. And in the central area, it's just like that. So what we do mainly is to see how we could change narratives, tag, rehumanize Nigeria. And what we do mainly is to see how we could also pass out all those messages that will talk about the issue of what binds us together as one nation, and not what divides us. So we talk more about the issue that unites us as a nation. We talk about something that also see us as human beings, instead of spewing all those hatred and what could divide us. Because we also find that even the political class, the elite, they use that mostly to divide, and then through radio. There's a group in Kano called Sodipo Berger. What they do mainly is to go to the radio stations, and they are more like paid agents that talk about negative things about other groups. So what we do also mainly to see how we can also get across to this Sodipo Berger, and to see how we can also see them to turn their hate speeches into something that is good for the country. And that aside, we also look at issue that also has to do with even the online, because we have a lot of online hatred across the region, in the north, in the south, in the east, in the west. And then, like what is going on now, the issue of self-determination, both in the southeast and also in the southwest. And this, we find, all has to do with issues of hatred. Let's go to war, let's do this, let's divide the country. So, and what we find ourselves doing is to see how we could be as like the middle man, and to see how we could walk across. And we talk about the civil society groups that we work with, they are also across the country, and find both in the north and the south. And we use all the media they use, the radio, the televisions, the social medias. We have our messages that are across. We also pass our message across to see that yes, we counter most of all these hate speeches, because it's something that is so how will I put it? We also do issue of dehumanization, because how do Christians view Muslims? Because these are the things we also have to know. What sort of words are used by both religion, and how do and what are the stories that all the probably maybe in their home, in the comfort of their homes? Because it is not enough to talk about saying you are peacemakers, but when you go home, what do you tell your children? What do you talk within your family? How do you see other people? So, and another thing again is also to see that you as a peacemaker is also for us to know that we have to be conflict sensitive. We don't have to aggravate the tension. We have to strike between the balance and make sure that we don't tend to support. I could be a Yoruba person, and when something happens that affect my region, how do I react, and how do I analyze issues? So it's one of the things that we train and we tell our peacemakers is that they should be very, very objective. They should just put themselves out of the issues and see things from the lens of truth and lens of objectivity, because these are the ways we can talk about issue of peace in our country. And how do we also talk about the issue of all those story of good things about instead of dehumanizing, instead of labeling, instead of stereotyping in the sense that we also know, people say, well, as a Yoruba man, this is how you should behave. As a Muslim, this is how you should behave. As a Hausa man, this is how you should behave. We want to say, no, don't stereotypes, don't label. Look at people from their own individual differences. As I always say, Nigeria is like a family of 5, 6 that have different characters, and that is how we should look at it. We cannot just label and stereotypes, maybe someone, a Christian or a Muslim, or a Yoruba or Hausa man that do something wrong. We should not label other people and say this is what they are doing. And we see that happening among our politicians. The politicians, what they do, is to, for political gain, is to also spew all those hatred. The same in our programs. We also work with religious leaders. We work with political leaders, also with community groups. And above all, we also engage the youth, because we know that it's the youth that are really, they are the foot soldiers, and we try to see how we can also engage them and then let them know that, yes, the country belongs to all of us, and there's need for us to live in peace, and to live in harmony. So these are the things that we do. And we're above also that, we also do things that also bring interreligious, intercultural, religious meetings that we also do to promote peace and unity in our country. And the key area that we do, in our rehumanized Nigeria, we have this pledge. Can you see any? Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, Michael.
Okay, good. So in the key area of peace building investment, rehumanized Nigeria, what we do mainly is to see how we could also talk about the issue of developing advocacy, partnership with religious leaders, traditional rulers, and to reduce religious motivated hate speeches and also political speeches, and to also promote intercommunal, interethnic, and interreligious harmony using positive religious role models and local media, and also even celebrities, to see how they can also come out to talk about the issue of peace. Like in our programs in Kano, we use football, where we also bring football stars to talk to the young ones, the need for them to know that, yes, they have to live in peace with other people. And we also do expansion of interfaith and interfaith activities in form of town hall meetings, which are especially effective in engaging large number of young people. We do that almost only on quarterly basis, where we engage with people, young people, old people, everybody in the community, to see how we could talk about issue of peace in our community, and what are the issues covered in local peace building media campaign. We look at the current peace building efforts using the media. We also do use different outlets, as I've said. We use the Facebook, the TV, the radio, the community theater. We use radio and also talk show to, and how do we measure whether the effect of our programs. We look at it from the opinion and therefore from the audience. We look out for those media that have large audience that cut across the regions, like some radio stations. You find them in almost every region of the country. So we engage such media to disseminate our own narratives of peace, and work be the perfect outcome of what we are doing. And we also do that through also opposing the media that try groups, and we also look at ourselves as effective messengers, in the sense that we have to serve as role model. Who are we? What do we stand for? Programs in schools, through our Peace Club programs in schools, and these are the things that we do also to make sure Muslim background from the various ethnicity in the country, and to see how they shape their behaviors and then make them think like leaders. Not only future leaders, but leaders of today. How they can see themselves as leaders, and how they can also take charge of their communities and promote peace in the communities. So these are the things we do, and these are the things we also promote in our communities, and these are the things we'll be doing all over. So and another thing again we also do, we also engage even with government officials. Because we also know that yes, we can't just work alone, so we also engage with government officials. We work with government ministries and departments, and to also see how they can also buy into our programs, and then to know that yes, what we are doing is is for the benefit of all people. Because and we find out that almost every 3-4 years after an election year, that's where we find more of such hate speech coming on board. So now this is second year, religious and the ethnicity, I like the sentiments are now being played, roll out to see how they can also, because it's a matter of it's both political, it's both economic, it's also religion. It's just a thin line. It's a thin line of saying, well, it could be religious, and before you know it switch. It becomes
Michael.
Ethnic, and what if so all very very hard and also do also engaging them. That's not the way to go. You want to go.
Michael, I think your connection is fragmented, so it's very hard to hear you now. So I think thank you to Michael. That we heard most of what his presentation, in which he discussed both kind of the dangers he's seen of dangerous speech, of the prevalence of it in Nigeria, and how PIN also vis-a-vis the work that PIN is doing with Beyond Conflict in Nigeria and how it's addressing dangerous speech. So Michael, thank you very much. We heard almost everything. I think we'll definitely be able to take some questions for Michael in the question and answer, just to make once hopefully he restores his audio. So without further ado, now I'd like to welcome Tim Phillips, the CEO of Beyond Conflict, to present.
Thank you, Karen. I want to thank Michael, who is, we're very honored to be partnering with Michael in Nigeria, and also to meet Cathy in that really wonderful presentation as well. So what I thought I would do in my 12 minutes is maybe just sort of add to what Cathy was starting to articulate about dehumanization and why Beyond Conflict started looking at the science of dehumanization. So for those who don't know, Beyond Conflict is about 30 years old, actually next year, and very much worked in countries trying to make the transition from conflict to peace or dictatorship to democracy. And it was very much built on the shared experience model of learning. I often said it was like a big support group on wheels of bringing people who never imagined change or sitting across from their enemies and found a way to work together to try to transform their societies. And about a dozen years ago, we started looking at brain and behavioral science because it won't be surprising to anybody on this event that we struggle with intractable conflict, and there are a lot of fragile peace agreements out there in the world. And we are obviously missing something about the human experience. And what we started looking at was brain and behavioral science when I may have a couple of friends from Northern Ireland on this webinar. When I was teaching a course at a local university on conflict transformation, the human dimension, Jerry Adams came in from Northern Ireland and he spoke to the class. And a student asked, how do you sit across the table from somebody you may have tried to kill, or they may have tried to kill you or somebody close to you? And he paused and he said, it's tough to make peace with a humiliated partner. And there was a retired neuroscientist sitting in the room. And he came up to me and he said, you know, there's a lot of brain science, behavioral science behind these themes that have come up of humiliation, fear, empathy. And I knew some of the social psychology research, certainly what I observed, what I experienced in my own life. And I challenged him. I said, what do you mean brain science? And he said something really quite powerful. He said, speaking as a scientist, he says, we're not rational beings with emotions. In fact, we're just the opposite. We're emotionally based beings who can only fully think rationally when we feel that our identities, as we see ourselves, are understood and valued by others. And that recognition that, you know, the way we see ourselves as individuals or communities may not reflect objective reality, but if it's how we see it, it becomes our reality and starts to shape the reality of others around us. And we started exploring brain and behavioral science and realized from scientists that we had to focus on how we think, not just what we think, because how we think is so deeply unconscious. So one of the issues we started looking at is dehumanization. And as a non-scientist, I couldn't give a really thoughtful, framing from a research point of view on dehumanization. But I could tell you where I felt that maybe I've been dehumanized in my life. And I think every human being on planet Earth can at least tell you when they have felt dehumanized. And we thought it'd be really important to understand, well, can we understand the psychology of dehumanization as a cognitive process? And so we had a couple of major conferences, one several years ago at MIT in partnership with them. And one of the things that struck me, hearing from a behavioral scientist who does work on dehumanization, he said, in a sense, dehumanization is literally how we navigate our social world. That our brain's capacity to fully humanize and empathize with people is limited. And it's not because we make a conscious choice to limit it. It's because of our literal energy, brain capacity to fully engage with others has a bandwidth limitation. And it's surprisingly and disappointingly about less than 100 people. And I say that because we then started unpacking, well, what do we know about dehumanization? Because if we want to actually do something about it, then we should understand as much the cognitive processes involved. And so we were able to launch this Decoding Dehumanization initiative, which Karen will talk about in the context of what we're doing with Michael and partners in Nigeria. But it was to understand, what do we know about the nature of dehumanization that's based in research and evidence? And over the last 4 years, the first phase was looking at the research. So on our website at Beyond Conflict, we have the report on decoding dehumanization as a policy brief. And then the second phase, and Karen has been leading both, has been looking at, okay, based on the research, can we design interventions with partners like Michael in Nigeria to actually see if understanding the cognitive processing of dehumanization in fear could actually make a difference in how we design these interventions. And Karen, again, we'll get into that. But as I think Cathy made some really, among the many, great points. And one is accusation in a mirror. It's a frame I never heard before that makes violence necessary because this is a threat coming towards us. And I think what's really important about dehumanization is as a cognitive process, it makes it possible. And the thing we have to recognize, and it's not going to be surprising again to the folks on this call, is that as a species, we do some horrible things to each other and to other species around us. And for me, one of the things I recognized is literally when we pass by homeless people, when we pass by people that are different from us, in a sense, because we don't stop and engage with them, that's a form of dehumanization. It's not like an explicit, blatant, we see them as less than human, but in a sense, our unconscious brain is processing that we have less responsibility here. And it can take different forms. So some of the research shows that objectification, when you think of misogyny and sexism, is a form of dehumanization. When we see communities of people in mechanistic terms, when, during World War II, when you see the goose-stepping German soldiers, or during the Cold War, the goose-stepping Chinese soldiers, we deny them any mind, in a sense, by just seeing them as some mechanistic blob almost, or an automatic mechanistic grouping. And then the worst is animalistic dehumanization. And so when we see people in terms like they're vermin, they're rats, they come over our borders. Our recent president, unfortunate president, I'll out myself on that, used the most dehumanizing animalistic language. And what we know from the research, and you can see it in Rwanda, and Cathy, you laid it out in that sort of pie, is there are steps to not only dehumanization, or as you called it, accusation in a mirror. We think of it as cognitive steps that allow our brains to disengage from others, to disengage in a way that allows us to do absolutely horrible things, or to disengage in a way that we just walk by homeless people on the street. And the more we unpack how our brain processes really the social environment around us and where dehumanization fits in, the more we hope, and this is why, again, working in Nigeria and elsewhere, we can actually have evidence that these insights can lead to maybe more effective interventions. And we're excited, Cathy, that you are here in Dangerous Speech because of the really important work that your group has been doing around the world. And I want to make 2 or 3 related points. So before COVID, I would tell people that one of the really interesting salient findings from dehumanization research, and this has been confirmed in fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging of brains, is that we process disgust differently in the brain than fear. So when you think about fear, and that is such a key component, but you recognize that fear and disgust are processed differently. And I used to say to people, and I know this is, in quotes, disgusting, but this is what we're talking about, that pre-COVID, if you sat on a plane in the middle of the winter and you're in an aisle seat and somebody walks by you and sneezes on you, what is your response? It's a disgust response. It is a pathogen response. You pull back, you contract, you push away. Because this is a threat that you can't control, that it's a direct threat to your very survival. Whereas if a bully to you in high school came on the plane, you put your head down, you look the other way, you hope that person doesn't see you. That's a fear response in the brain. And understanding that we process disgust and fear differently is really important, because then the interventions, and that's what Karen will talk about, what we looked at. Are we looking at Nigeria more a fear response or a disgust response? Because when disgust is engaged, it can lead to mass atrocities. It can lead to ethnic cleansing. It can lead to genocide. And so that's what we've been trying to unpack, both with the research and with the interventions. And here in the United States, all you have to do is look at what happened on January 6th. And, it's hard for a lot of people to understand and believe, but many of those people thought they were defending American democracy, at least as they saw it. But it didn't take long for people who supported not only Donald Trump, but Mike Pence. Once word came out on social media from Donald Trump that Mike Pence wasn't supporting him, you saw people at the Capitol now referring to him the way they were referring to Democrats. They said he supported pedophilia. He's a threat to us. An instant, within certain communities, how quickly a person became a threat. And so you can trace in this country over the last 4 years how language not only lead some people to justify not only those who took action, so to speak, on January 6th, but really, unfortunately, the millions of people who thought that was justified. It's drenched in fear, but processed through language that made, that not only dehumanized people or saw them as a threat to your very status. And so we really need, it's incumbent upon us, not just internationally, but here in the United States and all of us, to really understand the nature of dangerous speech. What are the cognitive processes that make horrible acts possible? And what are those things, as Cathy said, makes it necessary to people, where they feel that this is a necessary step? So there are a couple of things I want to mention in the context of the United States. So last June, it's hard to believe a year ago, we released a report called America's Divided Mind. And what we looked at was the psychology of polarization in the United States. And with our colleagues at the University of Pennsylvania, what we looked at was, where are Democrats or Republicans who in a sense have aggregated a lot of the fault lines in the United States on issues, big issues like open borders and immigration or gun control? Where are Democrats, Republican on like and dislike of each other? And where are they on dehumanization? And what we found is that we are heading, it's no surprise, to deepening identity-based polarization in the United States, where it's us versus them, very sectarian. And once we know from the research is that when polarization becomes more about identity and less about profound disagreement, then a whole range of unconscious psychological processes kick in that operate, so to speak, under the hood to drive us further apart. And so we can see both empirically and also in the research that the United States is heading in that direction. But what's also interesting is when we ask the question to Democrats, for example, and Republicans, we'd ask a Democrat, where are you on the issue of open borders and immigration, a big contentious issue? Democrats would sort of self-describe having some strong positions about immigration, but a lot of people in the middle. And then you'd ask Republicans some strong positions, a lot of Republicans in the middle. But if you'd ask a Democrat, where do you think Republicans are on open borders? They'd say they want them completely closed. I mean, a Democrat would say about Republicans, they want them, completely closed. And a Republican would say about Democrats, they want the borders completely open. So on issue after issue, they were off by 50%. And even on how much you dislike the other side, and more importantly, how much you think they dislike you, it's up near 50%. And even on dehumanization, when you give this very blunt scale of the ascent of man from early primates to humans, and a 0 to 100, and we did this in 13 countries around the world, where you'd ask a Democrat, where would you place other Democrats on this? And they would never be at fully 100%. Republicans would do the same, and others around the world, because we all know within our tribes and families, not everybody is, fully equipped, so to speak. But when you'd ask a Democrat or a Republican, where would you place the other party on this? It'd be in the mid-80s. Not great, but not horrible. But if you'd ask a Democrat or Republican, how much do you think a Democrat or Republican dehumanizes you? It's up near 50%. So we're sitting in a moment in our country in which what we think the other side thinks about us and about issues is off by half. And that is helping shape this toxic political environment we're in. And so the more we can have research about issues like the psychology of polarization, or strategies, which Karen will talk about in Nigeria with Michael, looking at, are we looking at disgust or fear? Are we looking at dehumanization or fear response or threat perception? to address these. And that's a big part of what we're trying to do. And I think I'm probably coming up to my time, Karen, but it's clear that the work that Cathy and Susan have been doing is really important. And I think it's a really interesting contribution to think about the accumulation and mirror what makes violence necessary, meaning why you think violence is going to be required here. And somebody once told me many years ago that fundamentally what's at the basis of fear of change is uncertainty what's on the other side. And since we often don't know what's on the other side, those who shape the narrative of what's on the other side can lead us in very bad directions or elsewhere. So maybe I'll just stop at that, Karen, and then I think we go to your presentation, and then hopefully we have some other time.
Sounds good. Thank you so much, Tim. That was a really interesting presentation, as always, to frame the issues in respect to international and American examples. So I'm going to just put together, play for you a presentation that touches upon the various bits you've heard already from Cathy, Michael, and Tim. And I assume you can see that. Yes, thank you. So I don't think it'll be a surprise to anyone that we often see media articles and social media posts that feature dangerous speech after particular acts of violence. And these are examples from Nigeria. Michael actually touched on one of them. You'll see in the quote from the Financial Times, actually, killer herdsmen. This is a headline that's regularly used in newspapers to refer to incidents when Fulani men are involved even as victims. And social media is rife of examples of dangerous speech that's used by influential figures. And here are some examples, again, from Nigeria. The picture you see is of Jack Bros Yellow, who's a prominent leader of a bandit group. And he's used WhatsApp and Facebook often to incite followers to use violence against Christian farmers. And the most prominent example on your left is a post that was taken from today by the leader of the indigenous people of Biafra, Mazi Kanu. And you see how that he uses threat perceptions and dehumanization about Northerners, basically alluding to Muslims and people from the ethnic groups Hausa and Fulani in the north of the country, even using the term Zoo that Michael mentioned as well. And his Twitter account has a reach of over 300,000 followers. Now, part of these narratives is that they contain threat perceptions, and Cathy mentioned that in her presentation. And the allegation in these examples that Muslim herdsmen intend to wage jihad in Nigeria and impose conditions like the ban of alcohol, or the alleged interest of Christians to dispose of Islam altogether from Nigeria. And we know the news articles and social media posts that follow violent incidents, they often simplify them. They often use misleading images and headlines. They reinforce dangerous stereotypes that dehumanize the other group and that increase these threat perceptions that lead to higher support for violence. And this is not obviously specific to Nigeria. This is all around the world. Now, why is this dangerous? Well, we conducted research in 12 countries with over 10,000 people. And we found that blatant dehumanization, which is the humanization that's done in obvious, non-subtle ways, that it was one of the strongest predictors of hostility between groups. And one of the places you won't be surprised to know that it covered was Israel-Palestine. Now, what did this research find? Well, it found that blatant dehumanization predicted attitudes and policy support that related to targeting civilians, that related to support for collective punishment and also for war. And as the examples that I mentioned from Nigeria illustrate, that dangerous speech can be easily used as a tool by influential elites to mobilize groups against each other, to peg them against each other. And basically dangerous speech makes it easier to remove the moral concern that we associate with killing, with discriminating against a group of people, or even torturing others based on their group identity. So When we decided to focus our intervention in Nigeria to tackle dehumanization, threat perceptions, and support for violence, we immediately thought to focus on Kaduna State that Michael mentioned. This is a state that's been in the Middle Basin, that's been experiencing intercommunal conflict over the past 2 decades, that's resulted in a great deal of thousands of people killed and displaced. And what we found in our baseline was that a great deal of people had both saw the other religion as a major threat, that they said that the other religion was violent, and that there were huge numbers of people, 59%, who had a family member injured or killed in an interreligious clash, 12.5% of them who had been personally injured. And so when we considered our approach, we began to think about the power of social and behavioral change communications, particularly those that we knew we could use through the power of the media. And why is that? Well, because social and behavioral change or aspects of use of behavioral science allows people through the power of the media to identify with fictional characters, but aren't threatened by them like they would be in person. And they allow the larger perspective taking, similarity, and parasocial contact between characters from different social groups in these fictions. They also they can also serve as a signal of norms, because as families and friends sit together and watch the storyline unfold, they talk about it and they discuss that. And so both the media channel itself and the viewing experience allows for social norms to change or to be impacted. We also know that media interventions are extremely scalable. They can reach millions of people versus hundreds through contact. And so when we considered this approach, we started to think about the narratives themselves, or what we call transformative narratives, and in the storylines, which are extremely important in part of this design. And they don't just show everyone getting along immediately. They do it much more naturally, because doing so of showing people immediately getting along would just not reflect reality. And there is conflict, there's animosity and distrust between the characters, and the storyline also reflects characters about what the characters really think about each other. And in this context, it was what Christians really think about Muslims, and vice versa. And you heard Michael mention that as well. And so overall, our approach was that we need to address the challenges of interacting with someone from the other religion and show how characters would overcome those challenges. So armed with this approach, we set out to address dangerous speech, and particularly the role that dehumanization and threat perceptions play to normalize intercommunal violence. We first looked at how we could do that, studied how a radio program could be used to spread narratives that dehumanized Christians in the eyes of Muslims and vice versa. And when we saw the results were really promising, we began by studying how a storyline in a popular TV drama which was informed by insights from social and behavioral science, how that TV drama would be able to rehumanize. And so the characters in the drama series called Dadinkoa, which reaches a viewership about 40 million people, a huge amount of people. The characters in the drama series, they showed real emotions and they were relatable to viewers. The storyline felt natural, like the premise of the Christian character Ladi Musa and the anxiety that she feels when she arrives in a Muslim town for her national service placement. There she meets with a colleague who's one of the main existing characters, a beloved character in the drama series called Bintu, who is equally suspicious of her, and she's based on the stories that she's heard about Christians. But when they get to know each other, they realize they have a lot in common. Both have suffered interreligious violence and had family members affected by it. They share favorite music, and they begin to build a friendship as the season airs. So to see how the storyline could potentially affect the perceptions and behaviors of our viewers, we surveyed about 1,750 people from Kaduna, residents from Kaduna, and we wanted to compare those who watched the show versus those who didn't watch the show. So in order to get a sense of whether watching Dadinkoa would have a causal effect, basically leading to improved interreligious outcomes, We used a design that was similar to A/B testing, in which we randomly assigned some people to watch the show and some of them not to watch the show. And so 1/3 of those 1,500 people, 1,750 people, watched John and Koa. Another third watched another channel altogether called the Africa Magic Hausa. And another third, we just sent current event quizzes. And we sent them a survey 1 to 3 weeks before the season aired, and then another survey 4 to 8 weeks after the season aired. And the reason we did this is because we wanted to know whether the effects lasted for more than a few days. These are our study outcomes. These are the areas that we were trying to see if we could move their perceptions on. So the first one was dehumanization that I addressed in the beginning of this presentation that you heard Tim talk about. And these are the sort of questions that we asked about whether someone believed that the other religion was brutal, primitive, or sometimes acted like animals. Threat perceptions here being whether the other religion posed a major threat or wanted to impose their religion beliefs on others or wanted to physically harm them. Whether or not they had negative stereotypes of the other, whether they considered them fanatical, deceptive, immoral, or violent, and whether or not they supported interreligious violence. And this is the question we asked. And so when we looked at our correlational results, as I said, we sent the survey 1 to 3 weeks before the latest season of Don and Koa began airing, and we found there were no differences in interreligious attitudes between people who watched Don and Koa and those who didn't. But when we sent the survey 4 to 8 weeks after the latest season of Don and Koa aired, which was around, this happened around December of last year, of 2020, what we found is that people who watched the storyline reported better interreligious attitudes and behavior than those who didn't. Overall, here's what we found. These are what the differences meant. Those who watched Don and Koa dehumanized the other less. They perceived the other religion as less threatening. They endorsed less negative stereotypes about them, and they were also lower on an interesting measure called competitive victimhood, which pegs people against each other as to who is the bigger victim, and often people who feel more victimized support more violence against the other. And they were, in fact, lower on competitive victimhood. They also reported less support and willingness to participate in interreligious violence, and they reported interacting more from the other religion. So we saw people who were over the last month, since they had finalized saying the last episode, they invited someone from the other religion to dinner in their home. They traded with them. They talked about trading more with somebody in a market or inviting someone to an event from the other religion or attending an event where there was someone from the other religion present. Things that they were more likely to do after watching the show. So this is the last slide I'd like to show you. This is a scale that we use, and it's ranked from 0 to 1. And at the baseline, you see that in the baseline overall, if you remember, there was no difference in any of these measures. And if you look at the threat perception graph, you'll see that for those who didn't watch the storyline, they fell about a 0.4. This is so before watching the storyline, before watching the storyline, they fell about a 0.4, and then 1 to 2 months, again 4 to 8 weeks after watching it, people who watched it were then a 0.3 on threat perceptions. And this is similar to what we found in dehumanization. They started at 0.3 and ended at 0.2, and in other measures like negative stereotypes also went down to 0.4. And in social science, these are really large differences. It basically shows us that 1 to 2 months after the show, this shows that there's real promise in this sort of media intervention, that the storylines can really have a societal impact. And they're not just it's not just going to communities and doing an intervention that's going to have an impact on 100 people, but that these sort of interventions are able to reach millions of people. And overall, what we learned from the results of this research is that one of the best ways to rehumanize members of another group in conflict is to show common human traits about them, is that to show that the power of narratives by reflecting on what's common to the human experience and challenging the position that one group is lesser than the other. So with that, I would like to stop here and take any questions that you might have. Is there anyone who has a specific question? I think you can raise your hand, so please feel free to do so. I saw, Chad, you have a few questions. Thank you for posing them. Your first question was to Cathy. Cathy, social media is a form of explicit communication that allows people the time to articulate and craft their messages. Do you also analyze functional support, social support in this context? And do you have methods of analyzing dangerous speech that's enjambered or vested within speech acts, or ways to identify influence or modulated speech? You can find those questions in the Q&A too, Cathy.
Sure. So I think I might need a bit of clarification about the functional social support. So perhaps Chad could provide some other context there, but I can tell you a little bit about how we analyze speech that has maybe been influenced. I'm imagining that means kind of from another speaker, right? That speaker's ideas have kind of come through the speech. Is that what you're talking about? If so, we often think of this as kind of we call it a second speaker, right? So when we're analyzing the authority that's brought to speech by a particular speaker, there are often times where there might be someone who is sharing that speech, right? Who is the primary kind of mouthpiece for it, but that they didn't write the speech themselves. We saw this a lot with our past president in the US, that he would retweet something, often from a more extreme account, right? That didn't have that following or that authority, but that when that speech comes through this new medium, through a new speaker, it has more influence. So we do kind of look at this chain of influence that comes through speech when we're trying to understand both the impact that the audience it can reach, and also the content. But I'm sure I did not answer your full question. Could you clarify the other parts of it for me?
Hi, yeah, am I speaking?
You are.
So you did answer some of the question, so thank you for that. The second part of that question is sort of a natural language understanding problem, where certain parts of speech are sort of that like language isn't transparent. Like it's not so easy to sort of analyze what parts of a sentence may indicate someone's likeliness to commit a dangerous speech act or contribute to it. And then the first question there about functional social support is about sort of receiving support in context. And the way I've seen functional social support being enacted is it's this back and forth between two groups, and the two groups are sort of supporting each other, even in context. If one group is yelling at another group, the group sort of functions together to construct a narrative in context in real time. And so I'm curious if outside of social media, if there's a real-time level of analysis that you're bringing to understand how dehumanization is happening in sort of in the context of theater, like on the ground conflict.
So, I mean, so this is, it's a bit hard to say, and it's a bit hard, I think, to separate out social media, and like oftentimes people will say online or in the real world, right? And I think that all of the research that I've seen is really kind of pushing back against this distinction, and that often you see the two playing off of each other in creating a narrative. There's a lot of interesting research out there on the way that we see increases in hateful speech online connected with increases in hate crimes, right? But there's a lot of debate about which direction that causal arrow goes, right? So does an increase in hate crimes then result in people feeling more emboldened to speak that way online, which then, or is it the reverse? And so I think we are kind of trying to look at this larger context of what is happening. And it's one of the reasons why doing the 5-part framework analysis is so useful. Even though it is this really kind of complicated qualitative analysis, it does allow space to see these as full processes versus looking at kind of a list of words that is triggering an event, right? So I think that that's kind of the best way to answer that part of the question. The other question about which parts of the sentence, I mean, I don't think we necessarily think, again, like if we aren't looking for a particular list of words. I think what is really interesting though is your point about how it's often very complex and kind of coded language that is what people are responding to. And so 2 quick points that I'll make about that, and then I'll pass it off to another question, is just that one, the dangerous speech doesn't have to be intended to be dangerous, right? That often the outcome of that speech is much more important than kind of the intent of the speaker. And the other thing I'll just say is that we work with researchers from around the world to analyze dangerous speech in their own context, because we understand that so much of that speech is coded in a way that we wouldn't necessarily see it as being dangerous, whereas someone who's living within that context might very quickly identify this as something that can be highly inflammatory and very dangerous in that particular moment.
Thanks, Cathy. We have another question from Salim Charles. It's directed to Cathy, but I think everybody should have a chance to also answer it. So Cathy, do you want to start? And then I'd love for everyone else to have it. It's, as peace builders, how do we engage the political class countering dangerous speech? This is because most of the time they are the most perpetrators of this vice.
Yeah, it's a really great question. And I think it's something that we really do need to put pressure on political leaders to condemn the speech when they hear it from, especially if it's someone who is kind of like them in some way. We know that the research suggests counter speech is much more effective when it comes from another member of the in-group, right? Someone that the speaker or people who hold the views of the speaker identify with as kind of like me. So holding political leaders accountable to condemn the speech or politically violent acts when they see them. And we released a report in the end of last year about political codes of conduct from around the world. And we found it very interesting that many of these codes of conduct that are written for politicians include not only restrictions on what they are not allowed to say, right? You are not allowed to engage in hate speech, for example, but some also include requirements for what they say, that they are required to condemn political acts of violence when they see them. They're required to condemn kind of violations of the codes of conduct. Most of these are not kind of legally binding, they're voluntary, but there are some different mechanisms that are being kind of experimented with about how to put that political pressure onto politicians.
Tim, do you also want to take a stab at this question?
It's a great question, not an easy answer. I mean, we certainly know the influence, the normative influence has been laid out of leaders to move people in a very dangerous direction. The challenge then becomes, once you're in that environment, who then has the credibility within that community to move it back? Particularly when the leader or leaders that have been setting that frame are still active in a dangerous way. And I think we need more testing and evidence on what are the most effective processes. But one thing that we need to understand more, but I think is really important, is that focusing on just people's attitudes and raising their awareness, in other words, hearts and minds, doesn't always work in terms of changing people's behavior. That actually norms do much more to change people's behavior, which is an unconscious process for the most part. And then people's hearts and minds will often then follow to align with their new behavior without them in many ways even realizing it. So we spend so much time trying to get people to change the way they think, to raise their awareness, to change their attitudes, their hearts and minds, and struggle with success. And so the more we have evidence of what are those cognitive pathways that allow people to either change their behavior, or how do you connect with those leaders, or who can become a voice within a community, a convert communicator that can actually counter that dangerous speech. And I think this just needs, frankly, more research and evidence. I think, as Cathy pointed out, there's definitely a role for people to counter that, but I think we need to understand more, how do you sustain that over time, particularly in an environment where there's a constant feedback loop that's making it difficult. But Michael, I think, could probably add to that as well.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. Michael, would you like to add to that and also answer Chad's question afterwards about how you're able to tie dangerous speech to the geographic segregation of identity that you described.
Yes, yes. I want to contribute to the first question first, how we could engage the policymakers, decision makers on how to counter dangerous speech. A case in point is in Nigeria, mostly during election years, what we do mainly is to organize town hall makers and leaders, political leaders. And we also be able to sign like an undertaking and to also sign undertaking of good conduct or what we call peace agreement. As the case may be, I remember even during the time of both Goodluck Jonathan and President Buhari, they were made to sign an agreement that yes, it will be okay, there won't be any crisis. So we do that most often to commit them to a public, I would like to sign declaration where they commit themselves to activities of public statement they plan to make in collaboration, to make peace reign. So we do that often, almost during election time. But after elections, everybody go. The question from Chad, I think what I would say in part, there are strong relationship between geographic identity and then dehumanizations and then how would I call it segregation. Why am I saying this? I'm saying this because like it's not total, but it's just like when you talk about maybe like in the southeast of Nigeria, we find it's a homogeneous group, the Igbos. So when you talk about what they can do, that could be like a block. And when you come to the northwest, maybe northwest, you find another block of Hausa Fulani in the big that they also act just on their own. Like when you come to the southwest, we find the Yorubas who are also probably divided among in religious, Muslim, Christian. But when you come to the east, you find these are called Christian communities, and whatever they are doing there, will just come up in line with Christian doctrine, this Christian practice and everything. Which is that the way we say north or south, it is not. Because in the north, we find we have both Christian and Muslims, and also in the south, we have both Christian and Muslims. So it's not total. It's just
Michael, I think we've lost you.
Regional identities, religious sentiments.
Michael. Okay, unfortunately, we couldn't hear Michael at the end there. But please do follow up, Chad. I'm sure Michael would be happy to give you more information. I don't know if there's anyone else who has a question. I thought I saw a couple of hands raised, but they're no longer raised. No.
There was one from Pamela to
yes.
Cathy.
Thank you. Thanks, Tim. So, Cathy, you mentioned the counter speech is not often effective at changing people's minds on their own stances, perhaps because of the confirmation bias. But isn't a lot of the power of counter speech to reach people dependent upon the tone of the speech? In other words, if we demonstrate the genuine compassion for their fears and concerns, might the speech be more effective than if we were to show outrage or disgust at their original message?
Yeah, I do think that's true. My earlier point was more about this idea that when you tell, or in my experience, when I tell people that I study counter speech, I often am met with people who know this research a little bit, and they'll say, "Oh, that's great, but hasn't the research shown that that's not very effective?" Right? And one of the ways that we have been looking at this question is, what do we mean by effectiveness? And yes, you're absolutely right that there is research suggesting that the tone of the speech matters. There are also other qualities that matter. You know, I mentioned earlier that if the counter speaker is seen as kind of like the person who is posting the hateful speech, they might have more impact. Or the number of counter speakers, if there are more counter speakers responding to fewer people posting hatred, all of those things can have an impact on how effective that speech is in changing someone's kind of online behavior. And tone of speech is also very important because it's this norm that Tim was gesturing to earlier, speaking about, that we know that these kind of speech norms are contagious online. But I think that the larger point that I was trying to make is that there's another group of people that are, especially when we're thinking about online conversations, that can be an effective target of counter speech that we don't often think about, this larger kind of silent reading audience, that we often focus so much attention on just changing those people, those few very loud voices that are posting hatred and dangerous speech. And we forget that there are all of these other people who either might not feel brave enough to enter that conversation because it's so polarized, or that they might not have made up their mind about a particular issue. And a lot of the counter speakers with whom I've had conversations with say that they're actually speaking to that group instead of focusing their attention on the people posting the hatred.
Thank you, Cathy. I think that's all the questions we can take for now, because we end the session. The webinar ends now, but please feel free to send an email to any of the panelists to learn more about their work and answer your questions. And a sincere thanks for joining us today. It was a very interesting conversation and interesting presentations, and we were happy to have all of you here today with us. Thank you very much. Have a nice evening, wherever you are.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Cathy and Michael.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.